Hello, my name is Georg Zachmann. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel working on energy and climate policy. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Massimo Tavoni, who is professor at the Politecnico in Milan and who is also the director of the EIEE and one of the authors of the IPCC report. Today we want to talk about models for energy and climate. The idea of today's discussion will be to have a bit of a deeper dive into what's the purpose of those models and what they can deliver and what recent developments in modeling are. Massimo, so you've been doing integrated assessment models for quite some time. Can you try to give the audience some general introduction on what those models are and why we actually need them?
Thanks. Yes, I will do it right away. And thanks for having me today here. Yes, indeed, I started 2004. So yes, that's kind of 15 years now. Time goes by. And what are these tools? These are essentially software. This is essentially software running on a computer that tries to integrate various systems: the economic system, the climate system, the energy system, the land use systems, and so forth. So it's complicated computer programming. Can be easy or complicated, that depends actually. With the aim understanding what shall we do if you want to, let's say, reduce temperature within certain limits, or we want to alleviate or energy poverty or improve energy access, or if we want to test any energy policy before we actually do it. And these models simulate futures with different policies on shocks and policy interventions and tell us.
Can you give some justification why we need that complex models? I mean, some of the effects seem to be pretty straightforward, and you might want to look into them into much more simple frameworks that can be much more easily understood by policymakers. Sometimes seems like a black big box that results come out of. So why we need this complexity?
We need this complexity at different levels. Remember, some of these models are actually very simple. The most simple one is the one for which Professor Nordhaus was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences last year. And it's something that I used to teach in class. And I think everyone with a reasonable understanding of these systems can actually easily understand how it works. And that already is very useful for giving some insights. But of course, if you want to be more precise about all these interactions between different markets, between different systems, the environment and the climate, account for things which are very hard to describe in simple terms. I mean, think about the climate systems, how complicated that is. We know very little about all these feedbacks. The climate, indeed, we cannot predict weather. We can advance, so that just tell you how complex the systems are. And the economic system is very well another complex systems. And the interaction between complex systems is why we need, if you want to understand their interaction, why we need complex models. Of course.
Can you maybe describe one interaction of how the climate system essentially feeds back into the economic system?
The climate feedback can reduce economic productivity, can have direct impacts on our economy, on our GDP. It can have impact on specific sectors. So if you just want to describe the aggregate sector, the aggregate impact on the economy, you can use simple models. And this is indeed what Professor Nordhaus did with this one. If you want to more understand the processes behind it, what happens, for example, whether, if temperature increases, what happens to the energy demand? Is it going to increase because of more air conditioning, because it's going to be hotter, but maybe it's going to be cooler in winter time? How do two things balance off? That will depend also on extreme events from the climate. The same with agriculture. Of course, agriculture is very exposed to climate change, and you need to understand those feedbacks. So if you want to understand the detailed processes, of course, you need detailed models.
But the idea of these models is not only to calculate like an optimal pathway in a certain with respect to certain criteria such as welfare, but it's much more wider, as I understand.
It spans various different objectives. You can try to do a standard cost-benefit analysis. Economists like this approach, and it's very useful to some extent. You can also take policy as given. We can take the Paris Agreement, put it in, and try to understand what it takes to comply with it. And then we can go farther than that. We can look at all the directives and energy and the many policies that we have in the real world. And if you want to do the real world, then of course you need more detail because the policy context is much more complex.
You said earlier on today that there have been some misconceptions on integrated assessment models in the public sphere. Maybe you would like to give some examples of those and debunk them.
Yeah, I think criticism is good, especially in science. And there's been criticism about to what extent these models are reliable and trustable, of course, especially when we think about very long-term futures that we know very little about. And of course, no one knows the future, and these are not predictive tools. These are analytical tools for thinking what would be the consequences of having certain deployments over certain pathways as opposed to others. Criticism have focused, for example, on the thing that many of these models suggest technology will play a very important role, which is certainly true. But at the same time, some of these models lack the capacity or realism to model human behavior and societal transitions. These are hard to capture and are typically beyond the competencies of energy economists or techno engineers and are more in the social sciences. And so these models, for example, have been criticized for relying too much on technological solutions and too little actually on behavioral change. But to what extent this is true, and it's certainly true, I would say the community has done a lot of work in first of showing a lot of different pathways. There's no one way to get there, and you have to go to the top of a difficult mountain. Think about climbing K2, one of the most difficult climbs in the world. It's very difficult. There are various ways, actually. The first way that was pioneered in 1940s and has been used a lot is not necessarily the easier one. They recently found much more easier routes to get up. And that depends very much on your preferences. So these models are very much used to show, what it takes if you go from the west side or the east side of the mountain, and what will be the trade-offs. And those trade-offs might very well be very different in different contexts in different countries. And so different countries might also follow, in a way, different pathways. And this is the best use of these models. And the community has done a lot of work in trying to show all these possible routes, not just one. They started from just the classic ascent route, and then over time they moved towards showing how many possible routes are up to get up there.
And in your own modeling experience, are there now new questions addressed to those models that you don't have answers to yet, where kind of the research frontier is, where you think the biggest developments are to be expected in the coming decade?
Yes, there's been quite a lot of development on the interaction between climate and other objectives, environmental or social objectives. Climate, of course, is our focus, but there are so many interactions with other things. Energy access is one. Inequality is certainly another. Technological development is another, and so forth. So there's a lot of attempt to understand what are the interplays, trade-offs, or synergies also between the different sustainable development objectives. But mostly this has been done on the physical ones, how we want to preserve land and water. Much less work has been done on the social dimension of the sustainability, thinking about poverty, thinking about inequality, thinking about gender and so forth, and thinking about institutions. And that's where I think the frontier is, and I think we still have a long way to go. Social sciences have mixed, in a way, to a lower degree in this field than the art sciences.
As I said earlier, you're also one of the authors of the IPCC reports. So now the sixth version is coming up. What can we expect from that?
So yes, we just started in IPCC works with 3 working groups. 1 is the science, 2 is the impact, and 3, where I contribute, is the solutions. We just had our first meeting, and this is a process that will take another 2-3 years before it's finalized. I think what we can expect, well, we'll see, because of course IPCC reviews the literature, doesn't produce new science, it just reviews what's out there and kind of synthesizes in a way that can be useful for policy. And I think we'll see certainly various new things that have not been covered so much before, at least I hope so, you never know. One is one of these social dimension I was mentioning before. There's a clear push in the new ER6 to include more social dimensions and behavioral dimensions of the climate transition, to show different ways to get there, which are not necessarily technological based one. There will still be a big focus on technology though, because that is important, and there's big discussion to what extent innovative and disruptive technologies can get us there. So we know the basic elements of the transition: energy efficiency, decarbonization of the power sector, electrification of transportation, of the buildings. But we are currently lacking understanding of what are these extra disruptive elements that can get us really down in emissions as we are required by the Paris Agreement, because that would require a lot of extra effort, and we don't know exactly how to do this. So I expect the report to focus on that as well. Finance is certainly a big one. There's a chapter on finance, and the finance community is chasing us all the time these days, because they want to know what it would take in terms of their strategies, what this transition would take and would matter for them. And at the same time, they're also interested in knowing what would be the physical impacts of climate change on their assets and their risks. So these are the elements that I think will be most important and more innovative.
When you talk about distributional effects, will it be both about distributional effects between countries and also within countries?
Between countries, for sure. This has been done also in previous assessment reports. Of course, as you know, the IPCC report is reviewed by the governments, and we have to address as authors all the questions. The summary for policymakers is approved by the United Nations, so it's a little bit more political document, if you want, and it tends to shy away a little bit from this regional and country level consideration, but the report will have those. I hope so. I hope that this report will also discuss within country distributional consequences, both in terms of how climate change impacts the poor versus the rich versus the middle class, but also what are the consequences of the solutions to solving climate, such as carbon pricing or subsidies on both these different income classes, because this is obviously becoming such an important topic for policy that a lot of research is going in that direction, and I expect that to be synthesized in the new one.
Have you already seen some research that is actually doing that in the framework of large integrated assessment models, or is that to that stage mainly in partial analysis?
That is a lot in partial analysis, empirical studies that have looked at the incidence of these climate and energy policies. There's a huge literature actually, and so there's actually quite a lot of knowledge. And that knowledge has been taken on by some models, I would say, typical general equilibrium model, the models that economists have typically worked with mostly. So there's literature there that suggests what would be this distributional implication, and most importantly, what can we do about it in terms of policy provisions. But I think it still has to be taken up by the larger community, as I was saying before, reflecting this gap between the social and the more technological components of the models. And I see that coming, and I hope it will be coming in time for the Year 6, which will be published in, I believe 2022.
How would one represent social considerations in larger integrated assessment models, and would one try to have them as an objective, an objective function on its own, or more as a constraint to the system, or just as a scenario?
Ideally, we would like to have a definition of welfare and well-being which goes beyond the standard assumption that the more we consume, the happier we are. And that goes without saying. There's a big literature and evidence that, of course, people well-being doesn't just depend on consumption. It does certainly depend on how rich you are up to a certain extent. But a much richer welfare framework that also includes the distributional impacts and aggregates welfare within the population, and more than just the typical standard way of doing it, which is adding up in a very much utilitarian way. The well-being of everyone is certainly needed. I think that is a hard one, and we are certainly working along these dimensions with certain models, with certain tools. But what I see for the next very short-term future is actually the other way that you were suggesting. So, for example, let's suppose we have a future world where people are really committed, and then we're going to have a higher share of vegetarianism and more willingness to use public transportation as opposed to private transportation. And then we work out what are the implications. If that happens, then what would that mean for the rest of the system, and how easier or difficult, I guess likely more easy, would be to do the climate transition.
When you start looking into distributional effects of climate policies, do you mainly look into carbon pricing as the tool to be a proxy for all climate policies, or are you going to have other policies like subsidies and standards being represented individually? And do you have some grasp on what the differences and impacts of those policies are?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think exactly the purpose of having models that can better represent this distributional and social impact of policies exactly to be able to evaluate a wider range of policy tools. So carbon price is typically, carbon taxes or carbon prices is typically the instrument we use. But we want to extend, and actually we already do that, and that certainly will be important to look at other things such as you were saying, subsidies and standards. In terms of what will be the distributional impact, there are some studies that suggest that carbon prices can be certainly regressive in the sense that they might hurt the poorest part of the society more than the rich ones, but also suggest ways to compensate those. And whether that is politically feasible or not is another question, but theoretically this can be done. And the small literature that I've seen suggests that on the other hand, some of the other instruments might be a bit more difficult, more problematic in terms of distributional impacts. So that remains to be seen, but it's not so obvious that it's just carbon prices that makes the poor poorer. It seems already from some of these models and also through general equilibrium effects that this happens also with other instruments. I should also say it's also important to use the models in this context because you want to look at the full economic implications of the distribution of the climate policies. And these models can tell you what happens into the real economy and what happens also, to wealth. And when you do that, the good message, at least, which is in a way positive, is that some of these distributional negative impacts on the poor part of the society are smaller than what you typically get in partial analysis because of the larger economic implication of these policies.
We have all those nice models that are going to be continue to be developed and getting more sophisticated results in a more and more complex world. But who is actually using these models or for policy making? So who is your main audience for those?
Traditional audience, of course, is science. First of all, we do science and we publish all the reports. I mean, there are many communities doing these scenarios. There's the scientific community to which we belong, which I think has good standards in the sense that whatever we do is vetted by the literature review and the peer review process and by the academic standards. But there are also companies doing scenarios. There's also agencies, typically EIEE, International Energy Agency in Paris, and other agencies that also produce scenarios. So we are certainly not alone. The difference is that we have, as I said, academic standards for publication. And our main audience traditionally has been obviously the scientific community and also the policy community related to United Nations and the IPCC. That is our typical audience. Now, progressively and increasingly so, we are seeing interest also from corporations and industry, and I was mentioning finance, for example, as being one of these, in looking at our results and going beyond just the standard corporate or agency scenarios. So in a way, there's a larger audience now than certainly was only a few years ago.
Now, in both in member states' capitals and in Brussels, we are now also discussing long-term climate plans more forcefully with the long-term climate vision of the European Commission and the member states, both long-term scenarios and national energy and climate plans. Are this type of models actually being used in those contexts? Should they be used there? Should they be used more?
I think so. The focus on mid-century strategies, which is embedded in the Paris Agreement, exactly puts these kind of models at the center stage, because mid-century is kind of a turning point, if you want to achieve what has been suggested and actually agreed upon in the agreements such as the Paris Agreement, because that's around the time where emissions have to globally go down, if not to zero, to very relatively close to. So it's very much a focal point, and we see a lot of national governments around the world, not just Europe, now working on this kind of mid-century strategy, and the models are helping in those. I should also say, what we are doing a lot is also working with national models, more and more. You need the global context because you need these global pathways, but ultimately also the policy is very much a local policy. And we don't have the resolution to understand exactly all the sectors, all the member state differences in Europe, for example, all to understand the processes in developing economies, thinking about Brazil, India, China, and so forth. So there, what we do, we pair up with national teams, and we have open discussions and common protocols and common standards to develop science that can inform both global decisions, but also national decisions for the mid-century transitions.
But is there not some sort of legitimacy problem at some stage when the only people that actually understand where the numbers come from are relatively a small group of scientists that produce complex models and modeling results?
Yeah, that's always there, and I would say it's there for us as it is for also the other agencies that produce scenarios. The difference is that there are several differences. First, as I said, we have academic standards. Second, all our data is public. So you can go on the websites that we have, and I can point it to you at the end if you want to have a link. And all the data that we actually have done since already, I think, 5 to 6 years, everything is published and downloadable and explorable. So even if you're a policymaker, you don't want to get into the details, you can look at the scenarios and you can actually download the data and play with those. And third point, many of these models are well documented as opposed to some, let's say, other more corporate or agency models. And many of those now are becoming public source and open source. Not all of them, I would say, but several of those. Now, being open source is an important step. Of course, if the model is very complicated, it won't certainly help in validating models to the full extent. But I think these are certainly important steps towards being more transparent. And it's certainly more than what we have seen in other models being used around the world, let's say, for policy recommendations.
So you would say that we are not risking to any long-term fall into the trap of having to rely on a small number of relatively intransparent models, but actually the development is going in the direction of more openness and trying to keep policymakers relatively informed about what's going on in those models and helping them to understand it beyond the black box.
I think that's our aim. Whether we're going to be successful or not, it's an open call. I think compared to just a few years ago, where you typically had just a couple of agencies doing scenarios for the rest of the world, now we have a large community. There are about 20 to 30 institutes around the world doing this job. A lot of them also in the developing world. And so you're going to have a lot of different results, which might confuse policymakers. But on the other hand, it gives you it certainly diminishes the risk of having prescribed pathways in a consulting style that give you absolute certainty of what this transition will look like, when in fact we know this climate transition is very complex. It depends on the national and local context, and it's very uncertain. And in order to tackle these kind of things, we think the best way is to do collaborative science and community science. So we have science forums, which are, by the way, open to other parties as well, and have a lot of different models try to simulate different futures the same way the climate community is doing for the climate science. And publish those results in the peer-reviewed literature, and we do that in the top journals like Nature and Science. And I think that's our approach to being more robust. And more is certainly needed, but I think it's a good step forward.
Thank you very much, Massimo. That was extremely interesting. I hope the audience enjoyed as much as I did, and I hope we have you again at Bruegel in the future.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.